Okay, welcome back, everybody. I make that 11:30. Just a very quick warning. In the middle of John's talk, I actually dropped out for 5 minutes, which I thought was my internet, but turned out to be my computer throwing a wobbly. So if I disappear, I hope one of my colleagues will take over until I can get back on a laptop. Right, so very pleased to introduce Timothy Easton. Probably needs no introduction to most of you because he's spoken to our group many times, but I know we have a wider audience today. Tim, apart from being a fabulous artist, is quite an expert on old buildings and was one of the first people to look into things like apotropaic marks, which he's not talking about today. Instead, he's going to entertain us with the role of inns in entertainment. So thank you, Timothy, over to you.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to be touching on a few slides early on that some of you may have seen before because they were used for the Vernacular Architecture Group Spring Conference in 2021. However, I will be saying hopefully different things about some of those buildings and enlarging on it as well. My study was made 43 years ago in this place in Debenham, and Debenham is a very good, lively marketplace, or was in the medieval period, and its route, although not the main route to Norfolk, as you can see up here to Norwich, nevertheless there was a route through up here to Norwich, and across to Bury St Edmunds, which was a place-centered area. So I'll briefly touch on something that happened in Norwich that's related to the late 16th, early 17th century later on. And so from there, let's just carry on. So there's a plan of the town. Here is the marketplace we're going to be talking about down here. So the buildings that I'm referring to, there's an inn here, another inn over this side, one here and one here. Those four the main principal inns in this town. In the area at the back here behind the church is a piece of ground called the camping close, which was an area where activities like play could go on and is associated with inns as well. So there's the camping close, and you can see the two red dots that I show here are owned by the two biggest houses in the town. They both own the inns next door that are attached to those, and they both control the entrances into this camping close. And what is common with a lot of these people is that they were basically grocers, able to supply food, and that was very important if you got people going in there. So the place that was selling the drink next door, and they could sell the food as well, and people going into the camping close. So camping closes were used for a game of camp ball, which is a sort of like an American football, and this one was founded in the 1460s and went on until the early 17th century when it closed down. On a camping close, you could find other things. For instance, we have the records in Suffolk of another camping close, which I'm going to be showing you in a minute, where play activities went on. And so although this particular one is an illustration of the Route to Calvary by Peter Bruegel from the 1460s, 1560s rather, sorry, you can see that the actors, or at least the acting that's going on, which is the crucifixion, is going to happen in a place that's already ringed by people. Fine, that's okay for something that doesn't require the taking of money, but as you see, if money comes into it, you really need to fence it around and have some controlling mechanism. This is a drawing of the camping close at Walsham-the-Willows, in which there is a description from the 1570s, just at the time when the London Theatre was getting going, of a bank with fair trees around it, and in the middle a raised stage for the purpose of acting. My imaginative drawing here shows the entrance is controlled by a gate. That's important, and the audience is then standing, or possibly sitting, but I think mostly standing around on the bank looking at the play, that activity that's going on. And this is based on several medieval illustrations of play acting that I'm aware of. For instance, one that's associated with the Eastern Counties is the Castle of Perseverance, in which you have a round ring where the actors are going to perform in the middle of. It has a castle in the middle with a bed for every man to wake up and go through the morality play, where he's advised of a good life by the angels, and then the devil comes and leads him and tells him he can have a jolly good life without going into the church. And of course, at the end, there's a big gunpowder thing going on at the top of the castle here to bring him back into the body of the church. So this is a morality play from the 15th century. And this is an imaginative reconstruction done by, based on Richard Southern's work, done by Walter Hodges, who was a wonderful draftsman on explaining about how play places were operated. And you can see that castle in the middle with the bed underneath. But the thing I'm really trying to focus on is that round here you have scaffolds, standings and scaffolds. And that's what is significant about so many of the acting places. This is a famous example by Jean Fouquet from the early 15th century, and you can see the same thing here. You've got both the actors' scaffolds up here, and you've got audience who are sitting in these individual bays, which are linked together. And of course, this is the concept, the idea that you find in those theatres in London, particularly those that were polygonal. You get a series of galleries that join together like this. And most of the early plays we know were done by somebody who directed it from a book here. In Cornwall, he's called the Ordinary, and the actors do not speak their parts. He tells them what he tells them what to say at the appropriate moments. This is the Martyrdom of St. Apollonia. My dentist is called Apollonia, interesting. She's the patron saint of dentists. And he's directing the play from his book and telling them what to say. And in Cornwall, they have these round playing places called Planangweris, and some of them still exist, and you can go and visit them. This is the sort of illustration you often see. This is just from the 1600, showing play activity going on, but it's pretty hopeless because the people around it are being entertained, but they can slope off. And I know twice in my life, once in India and once in Germany, I watched an activity like this and tried to slope off earlier and was chased after by one of the actors. So it's not the best. It's not the best way to put on a play if you want to raise a lot of money. Much better that you might have something like this, which is presumably in the yard of an inn. But as you can see from some of the people sitting on the front on the roofs and things, it's not totally controlled. Much better to have something of this nature where the buildings go right the way around, and the acting company can set up its stage and the groundlings are in the yard watching the play. And if you have galleries around the inside, there are opportunities there for people to watch from the first floor level around here. I'm going to come back to that in a while, but I'm going to show you this building first. This is a building we think called the Ram. I say we think because it became a private house certainly by the early 17th century, possibly a bit earlier. And the name of the Ram went into the next door property, which I'll briefly show you in a minute. But the significant thing about this building is that it has a corridor running around the back. The big hearth here is for the cooking in the kitchen, and picking up on something that Julian Mumby said earlier on about not much difference between the hall houses and taverns, or inns rather. The thing I do find, particularly in Debenham, that identifies them is an extra large hearth, usually 12-foot long beam or greater than that, 12 to 14 foot for the preparation of food. So you have a gallery running along the end here. There is a loo, a guardrobe that comes down beside the chimney that's emptied from an arch outside. So there is the building from the outside. And if we put that in, there is the gallery running through the back of the building, which looks down into the courtyard. And this is a view of the side of the house on the main street. And this room on the corner here, which has a very large window just around the corner looking down at the marketplace, which was owned in the 17th century by the Tubble family, who had market stalls down there, so you keep an eye on his produce. It has a very large fireplace on the upper level there, for belonging obviously to this earlier period in the early 16th century, which was for sort of entertainment purposes. And this building has very regular windows all the way down it. For those of you who know Paycott's house in Essex, although the windows are reconstructed, it gives you an impression of the regularity of fairly high quality windows with glass in them all the way down the side. And there is a view, two views of one end of the corridor. You can see the internal windows have these very large square mullions, and this is the corridor itself. There is the rail, which is infill below, but was open above. And here a detail of the window with those square mullions, and you can see the infill, where the infill splints have been located. So looking down to the end of the corridor where the guardrobe is, here's the entrance into it, and the doorway is rebated round here. It must have been quite drafty. And when you go downstairs, it's that area there, which is now being boarded in with modern boarding, that was presumably cut off at this point with brickwork, because you've got this big hearth, the kitchen hearth here on the right. And that was the area where you could empty it at the back of that wall, which is now in the next door property. So there's a view of the hearth, and gives you an idea what I'm trying to say is that the hearths are generally unusually larger than domestic buildings for this. And so the corridor is here, and that area is just showing you is just behind that main bay post. The significant thing on the upper floor is that not only have you got individual doors to come in from the corridor into those rooms, but you've got interconnecting doors like these, which get you from one room to another. So presumably you could hire a room or a suite of rooms to do business here, or you to put your surplus goods and services in the next door room if you needed to. The house went into private hands, but we don't quite know when. Certainly by 1621, it was in the hands of the Tubble family, and there is a date on the porch at the front. There are wall paintings in this house. As you can see, the joined quatrefoils are very similar to the Cornhill ones you saw this morning in Oxford. These were superseded probably around about 1620 or 30 by plain scheme individual columns. On the real timbers, they were painted green, and on the plastered surfaces, they were given the columns on the surfaces there. I covered this in the vernacular architecture talk that I did, which you can get from YouTube, so I won't say any more about that, but you can see, similar to the corn market, the corn market design we saw this morning, the same sort of text that Julia Mumby was showing. And there's a detail. This has all been restored now, but this is the first time that it was shown in the late 1970s when we put an exhibition on in this town, and we managed to get the owner to take the hardboard off to show it, and subsequently it's been repaired, and you can see where fixed benches have been put where the painter has gone around the edge of it. And another section of wall painting in the house too, similar to the arabesque designs that we were looking at this morning. This is the sort of towards the kitchen end, but not in the kitchen itself. So this inn became a private house, and it went into this building here. There is nothing particularly unremarkable about the front of the building. The fireplaces are the normal size you see, but I was in there last week, and there is an extension at the back with a very large, much larger hearth there. So I think when this ceased to be the Ram, it took its name into this building and carried on business in that way. And I couldn't get the whole of the fireplace in because the kitchen has been shrunk a bit, and I couldn't get back far enough. But you can see it is a very large beam for the purpose of the cooking. Now, coming back to the camping close, we know that there was a building here called the Buck Inn. The Buck Inn has been replaced, but the cellars underneath, we don't have the vaulted ones because we don't have good stone in this part of the world, but most of the inns have fairly large early cellars, and the cellars are at the back of this 18th century house, and it's behind this building that there's a rather remarkable surviving grandstand, which was to do with watching sport and entertainment. The owner of that house is a member of the Harrison family. This building is 17th century, but the bit that is medieval, I forget Martin's date for this building, but I think it was around 1410 or thereabouts. But it's the main hall here, a big plushy parlour wing, and then a second wing here, which is contemporary with it. It has a contemporary join in that part, but it's this part here to the right of the door that is particularly interesting, because when it was being uncovered, and I had to dash down and do this in sections, I wasn't given notice of it, it was clear that the front of this building was completely left open. So you had a corner bracket here, a corner bracket, and two stabilizing braces curving down onto a plate, presumably a plate at the front here. So other than that, there was no framing in that building at all. It was made like that. The only building I know, well, before we go any further, there is the detail of that corner bracket just there. And you can see that there's a brace underneath the jetty, a position for another one here, and two further mortises here, which I want you to keep in mind when we go to a second in a little bit later, which is called the Red Lion. So this is the detail of that. And the only other building I know is this painting by Joris Hafnagel of a fete in Bermondsey, a marriage fete, where you can see an open-sided building. I have no idea whether this is purely fantasy on the part of the artist with the sort of kitchen next door, whether this is a type of existing building. But because it sits right next, because of the building I've just shown you in Debenham, it sits right next to the entrance, one does wonder whether it has some sort of link with the idea of people feasting, or at least getting their food from an open-sided building like that, that somehow they could close off at night. The other building, which is related in date to that early 15th century, is this building down the bottom of the street here. So the one we saw at the top, owned by the Harrison family, they were grocers. This was owned by Nicholas Bell. And the two men both shared a part of that camping close. This one, Nicholas Bell had an acre and a half of it, and the Harrison family had an acre of the top one. So they had both the entrances to this communal place where these sorts of activities could take place. The building itself is linked to an inn next door, or unfortunately it's just closed. It's called the Angel, and this drawing was an early one done in 78, and we now know that there was an open truss here, because presumably this was always an inn and had the Angel built as a purpose-built inn next door, and because it was a shared wall, they could put an open truss up against an existing building, or at least the existing wall of the building that was probably developed and is called the Angel. That too has a gallery around the back. I saw it last week. I've got to go back and do some work there. But the thing I'm just showing you is that in the Angel itself, in the main part of the two large halls, but this is enormously large. This is probably about 14 foot long. And so this is obviously a main cooking area within the building itself. So there's the structure of the building from the early 15th century, and the Angel joined onto this portion here. So this is the building I want to just come back to, because it was originally, we know this drawing here was done from was done for a conference at the Globe Theatre, which I was involved, courtesy of Peter McCurdy, who I think Peter would correct me if I'm wrong, was slightly concerned about the amount of decoration or paint that was going to be applied to the frame building. And so I was brought in to try and do a sort of sober colour scheme for the Globe Theatre, which we'll see in a little while. And so the Buck's Head Standing now comprises just 2 bays, but was originally a 3-bay building. And we know from the dendrodating of it that the plain side here at the back is 1609 and the decorative side here is 1621. Well, it stood on the camping close almost certainly, I think. The camping close, we learned, was closed in 1621, and lo and behold, in 1621 we have a new front. So I think they simply picked the building up, or at least perhaps took it apart and reconstructed it, and put a more fancy front facing into the inn yard of the Buck. What they put in, what they were doing in the inn yard, we don't know. Obviously, the 1621 was significant because we find the same thing in Norwich, that 1621 seems to be when they tried to put the brakes on any kind of playing activities. It did go on for a year or two after that. It wasn't just Puritanism. There were other reasons. There was plague, and there was also the need to provide for poor people, poor children and things, which seemed to be there in the Norwich case. And it's interesting, I'll touch upon Norwich again in a minute, that in the Norwich cases, the inns that had playing there were owned by grocers as well, who were often the mayors who had to give permission for the play to go ahead. So coming back to Debenham, this building was then re-erected for activities going on within the inn yard. Now, we don't know, we can't make any claims that travelling players like the ones who came up to Norwich, who were the Queen's Company, were the sort of people who came to Debenham. Of course, we don't know that, but Debenham has always had, or at least Suffolk has always had, homegrown acting companies. There was one, for instance, at Bungay. And so long as you've got somebody who's got the playbooks, i.e. the scripts, and who can galvanize a company together, right from the medieval period and through to the 17th century, they were going around putting on plays in different places to raise money, initially, of course, before the Reformation, to pay for things within the churches themselves. But that habit carried on. And so, you know, if you get a fairly charismatic leader, you can have your own home companies coming in. But I'm sure that they did have other activities like that. Whether they were players, in this case, we don't know. It could have been, well, we'll see in a minute, it could be other sorts of entertainments. But to give that building some sort of context, here's an illustration of King Arthur watching a joust, and you can see the very plain nature of these things are adorned by putting over carpets over the front, and for very auspicious people, they also have a leaning carpet and a cushion, and that you'll see time and time again in medieval illustrations. So paint actually didn't take very much of a part in this case. It was always done with a frame like this, which was hung with canvases to keep it dry in wintertime, and then sort of adorned with cloth at other times of the year. So, and I suppose the other point I want to make with this one, very similar illustration, is that you can see that the standing is literally people standing. I think that the idea that everybody was seated is a bit of a wrong one. Obviously, some people could in the best seats, but you're not going to get the kind of numbers, even in the London theatres, unless people stood in greater numbers than we're familiar with today. So in the upper galleries at the Globe Theatre, the Shakespeare's Globe, most people are seated. But I think originally probably quite a lot of them were actually standing, and so you had higher density of numbers which are recorded, comparative numbers to today. Right, so that just makes that point I was saying, that as with the 1543 standing that was built for Henry VIII in Epping Forest for watching the end of the hunt, these buildings were left completely open. John McCann and somebody else did a survey of that standing in Epping Forest, and found that there was no evidence that there was any contemporary infill within it until it got to be rebuilt under Queen Elizabeth's time, and that it was a structure covered with canvas in the winter, and then adorned when the king was coming to watch things with very fine cloths hanging up. And to some extent, I've just come back from spending 3 days at Henley Regatta, where I was working down there, and the main standing in the regatta is exactly the same. It's covered in canvas, and interesting enough, when the rail regatta finishes, they unhitch it and it swings out into the river, and it becomes the scaffold, the stage. And there is a confusion in the records between stages, as what they call scaffolds, or you know, whatever they're called, but they can double in a sense. That's what I'm saying. And so to give you an idea what the Debenham one looked like, here is an illustration from a London inn, and you can see that it's a 3-bay building, and the bit that's missing from Debenham is this bit where you've got an attached staircase that gets you up onto the first floor. And you'll notice that what is common with this, as the Debenham one, and also in the London, well, I think it is a London standing to watch some activities going on here, because I know a certain amount about this building, is that the lower part here is not occupied by an audience, so they're only occupying these upper rooms, but the yard itself can have people standing there. and you can put a cloth up against the bottom here, and a stage could be set up against the building. This has got a fenner straw to keep the water out, and possibly canvas is behind the timber work there to keep that dry too. This was the attempt of a slightly sober decoration for the Globe project. I hope I don't misquote anybody. It was John Greenwood, the architect, who is working with Peter McCurdy, who advised me that it was Mark Rylance' wish that the rest of the theatre should be decorated, because he felt a bit uncomfortable with this very elaborate stage that he was working on, and he felt the whole thing should be integrated or take all the paint off. So this was the attempt to give one scheme. There were two operated on. Neither were full-heartedly accepted at all, but we did our best, and they did adopt the leaning carpets for the first season. I think they were abandoned afterwards. And but as I say, I think probably cloth would have been the answer for this anyway. There was an argument I had, well, it was an argument I wrote to Mark Rylance to suggest that, you know, they really ought to cover the timber work in on the ceilings and add cloths between the bays, which is how I think it operated, not quite as it is at the moment. And I was passed back to John Greenwood, and so there it rested. So here we are, move on. And of course, the one sort of contemporary illustration, Arnaud von Buchel's illustration from the late 16th century of the Swan Theatre in London, and you can see the kind of arrangement where you have a stage pushed up against the back here, where you have the audience who paid the most money to sit up there because they came to be seen and to see the play or to hear the play. So they paid the most money. The next one with the gentlemen's boxes, and then the people in the yard here would pay only a penny, twopence and threepence up here. The bottom ones were lovingly called the stinkards. So it tells you the quality of people they expected to operate on the floor. And when we did this in 78, 79 for the exhibition in Debenham, this was Mike Finch and his wife did the figures. Mike Finch was the chap who helped me with all the drawings. This was an attempt to try and put the buck standing into operation. We adopted the idea of the curtain here with a full representing the actors coming out, a controlled gateway, but of course we don't know what other buildings survived. And in fact, the thing that we got wrong is that fence, which is up against the next door property. This is built on exactly the property line between Harrison's house next door and the inn that he owned, but he subsequently sold. So it was re-erected specifically on that boundary line. So I think the back may have been filled in with the old back, and it was just concentrating on this side here to watch whatever was going on in the inn yard. It may have been something like sporting activities, not we think they're very sporting, but bear baiting in that way. So who knows? But most of the contemporary illustrations that you see have the same sort of arrangement, people sitting on the upper floor behind the stage in the best seats, actors coming out from underneath, and then a stage in front. And of course, one mustn't forget, as I say, that the people going into these things were being sold drink and food outside. And examples from the Rose Theatre in London, which has good records, shows that Philip Henslow with John Chumley. John Chumley was a vintner, and all the profits of any bread and drink that he made could be shared. And the point was that of the takings at the box office, the controlled box office, it would be split 50-50 between the actors and the owners, Henslow and Chumley in this case, and they would then split it 50-50 again. That was the arrangement. But Chumley had to actually put in quite a lot of money to build the theatre, help build the theatre in the first place. So this sort of arrangement is picked up again in other places like Norfolk, Norwich. And actors during the time, both and before and after the plague, were going abroad as well. This is a well-known illustration of the fencing school at Gdansk, which is this square building down here. So not all these theatrical places were around. They always had the inn sort of tucked on the outside near the entrance where people would buy their goods as they go in. And if you look at this little building here, I'll show you the next one, which is a bit clearer, you can see it looks exactly like the standing we've just seen at Debenham. So you go in from the entrance, the stage is opposite here, and you've got that sort of arrangement on the upper floor. And this is one you can visit. It's in Amalgro in Spain. It's said to be early 17th century. I'm not sure I believe that. I think it's more like late 17th, early 18th century, but it's built on exactly the same format as some of the London theatres. And they use this for play acting, rather like the Bury St Edmund Theatre. It was used for storing barrels and wine in and drink and beer until it was recognised for what it was, and then it was restored. And they now have a sort of a cover that you can put over to keep the people in the yard dry if they're coming here to watch. Seated, of course, that's not likely to have happened. I think they were standing, but a gallery, which of course reminds us very much of the way that the inns presented themselves with the galleries around the back that could take advantage of those upper rooms, the upper corridor. And so just looking at the drawings for the London theatres, you can see where they were disposed on the south bank of the river, and the bear baiting ring too was used for play activities. So as I mentioned, these were being built in the 1570s, though there was an early one on the north of the city. And interesting enough, the Water and the Willow one, which is also of the same date, was probably already 100 years old. So I make that point that this is not a new thing going on that's happening in London in the 16th century. There were places in certainly the east of England and in Cornwall where playing in the round or playing in places that were controlled like that were already well known. And I've mentioned Walter Hodges and his very extraordinary vision of reconstructing these theatres, you know, some 40, 50 years ago. You know, it took quite a lot when there was nothing there to actually see to reimagine these things so well. He was a wonderful draftsman. So I pay full compliment to him. And so coming to that point about the way that things are hung with cloths, we can see from many examples of jousting stands that they're very elaborately covered with cloths above them. They have the same sort of arrangement with, they're hidden here, but with carpets over the front and a leaning cushion. And of course, several of these were put into long lines for the main jousting areas where you could get it going over 100 yards or so. And so the way they operated was you had the king in the center, ambassadors and queens, and then other things, rather like the state progress inside royal palaces, that you could go from box to box through curtains. And I personally think that's probably how some of the London theatres operated. Instead of having solid walls, you had hangings there, which would be the kind of visual barriers between the spaces. And so just finishing off with the buck standing, we can see that the turnings were further apart than as proposed in London. And the other significant thing is that all these type of structures don't have bay posts, they don't have braces, which is also what is being built in London. They were much more like a flat screen that you could look out of, and that's consistent with a lot of domestic buildings which also had these sort of galleried areas or long galleries where you're looking out of windows. They don't want things that you can bang your head on. And I want to come down to this building, which is the Red Lion. The Red Lion here it was an inn until 20 years ago and is now being bought by some people who have asked me to do some work on it. And they're trying to reapply to get the license redone, despite the fact that this was built in 1463 as a Guiling house, which is the place for the brewing and the baking, for the Guildhall, which is next door here. It's quite difficult to get that license re-established. So I talked to the architect this morning, and it's probably going to be August before they get a decision. However, this is the building we can have a look at. And so I've had some rethoughts about that building because first of all, we'll look at the Guildhall. Both of them were built in 1463, they're described as newly built. The Guildhall had a very large upper chamber for banqueting, no chimney in it at all at that stage, of course. And next door, there is an attachment built because when this ceased to be a Guildhall after the Reformation, it was bought by some more of the Harrison family, George Harrison, and he owned the Guildhall and constructed that building as well next door. So I don't think there was a building there originally. You had an external door which got you down a staircase. And that's the thing I want to focus on now, because I want to see what the relationship is between this place to dine in and the place where the drink and the food were being prepared in the next building. And so just to show you part of the inside, only half of it is now being exposed, and that's two of the bays, these two down here, which you can see. And the other half, which has been smartened up, but it's not been opened up in that way, gives you an idea what it was like before they opened those spaces up. So you can see it had attics up here, and then there is part of the external door hidden now by the staircase going up into this zone up here. So that's the door that took you down the staircase to the bottom where the guarding house was. The corner of that building has a very elaborate corner post. It was drawn up in the about 1850-ish. And unfortunately, the bottom half of this, well, we can't see it now, but they've hacked the bottom. This was repeated on the bottom half here, but on the this is on the southern side, but on the eastern side here, this is the east face. So it's now cloaked in front of this extended building, and you can't see it. And I'd known this drawing for a long time, from the 1970s, but I thought these were windows because it was only relatively recently, and John Walker took this photograph, which he kindly sent to me, that this was about 3 years ago, that they'd taken this off and revealed that window. I had seen this recently, sort of now it had been plastered over, and had thought, oh yes, it's part of a window, that's interesting. But once I was asked to look a bit harder at it, it turned out to be something, I think, a little bit more interesting. I can't say whether now from my memory whether I remembered that I could spot that there was paint on the surface of this, but certainly we know it was painted. So the other thing I want to just say about this, when I used this building before in that spring conference in 2021, one of the questioners was Dermot McCulloch, who said to me afterwards, or during the question time, and did I think, I'd always known that it probably carried on being an inn, but he said, did I think that it was actually serving a drink to the public while it was providing the services for the Guildhall, who owned it? And I hadn't ever really given that any thought. And I think he's absolutely right, because we can see from underneath the jetty here that there are spaces which delineate not only doorways, but possibly the pegwork shows that there might be a pair of windows here, which could have been a serving hatch or serving from the shop window, in a sense, to people who are coming to buy food and drink, surplus to the material they were actually providing for the guilds. Because after all, they're not doing that the whole time. They're doing it during the feasts or when brethren are seen off to the other world. So it's not an activity that goes on every day. However, let's just have a look. So this is the one that became exposed that I thought was a window, until I went into this locked door, which I'd never been into, just in the corner here. And there you can see that there are two more of these. And this is a very, very rough drawing I did there at the spot, which isn't accurate, but you can get the impression. This is the one you can see from the street, and then you've got two more inside. And the question was, what are we looking at? If it's not a window, because the boards at the back of them are like a screen in a church, exactly what's going on here. And so I got a carpenter friend of mine to mark out, with the permission of the owners, a bit of the cement rendering, which we took off. And we could see that what we were looking at here was actually a much deeper sill, which wrapped around, rather like you find in Oriel windows, which wrapped around the bottom here. So that's how it looked there. So this is actually a decorative panel, 3 panels, which were above the main doorway coming out from the kitchens and the brew house area, directly underneath, directly in line with the staircase that came down from the Guildhall. And you can begin to see the sort of shadow of red paint on here. And so I sent it to be analysed by Dr. Catherine Hassel. who very kindly put me right about some things which I had misunderstood, as I'll explain in just a minute. So putting those three together, the only one I could photograph straight on is the one on the outside. And you can see that these two are different conformations. So I've done a bit of trickery with paste and glue. So this is just a rough put together, but these wide mullions here are painted white with red down the center. And it appeared that there was something like a sort of greenish glow here, which turns out that this has been heavily varnished many, many times. And it may have been painted white, lead white. But the red is unusual. It's vermilion with a touch of red lead in it, which for an outside thing rather strikes me as unusual. I'll have to ask Andrea about that. But vermilion is generally used, I think, for internal things rather than outside as far as we know. But just to go on a bit, the other illustrations that I sent very briefly to her was what looked like black paint over the red, which turns out just to be the dirty varnish. It's not black at all. There's no black in it. And what it had looked like sort of slightly green is sort of luminescence, I think, coming off those dirty varnishes over something which is paler underneath. But this is on its way back to me. There's a loose bit of timber there, and she analysed the colour on here, which is, you can probably see, is already a sort of carmine colour, which is that vermilion. And that's what I thought was black. It's not. It's just dirt accumulated. But the very fact that the paint has survived from the 1463 period indicates to me that it was probably always covered over with the pentis. And remember that doorway I showed you a little bit earlier? I think that there was something projecting out from there, which linked the two buildings together, because this was the drawing that was done for 79 exhibition, where you can see the vats were put at the back here in the Geiling House. It too has a gallery over there which looks down. It's got to be re-examined, but it's this area here which you can see is the link between the bottom of the staircase and the area where this door is. And if I show you a plan, you can see there, this is the door, this is the staircase coming down. There is the position of the door. There is the kitchen hearth at the back with the brew house area. And the only part of that building of that particular period, it says both these buildings are newly built in 1463, is this section here with a staircase to get you on the upper floor to this big room on the first floor, and an extended porch that comes out into the street, a very long porch. And this particular room is open. You can go straight from there into the porch chamber. There is no wall infill, and presumably this continued as a kind of oratory, and we think this is where I think this is where the priest had his rooms on the upper floor. So you've got a private section in the front half here, and the business section of the brew house, the Geiling House as they call it, in the back. And there you can see there's the open side of that building, and there is the extended porch, which there are fragments going up in the roof which show exactly how it was put together. And the door, I've just pasted that in to show you roughly where that door should fit in. So this was the extent of the building of that period, just this bit here, and this is 16th century, further extension later on. So there's the Harrison family who took it over after the Reformation, and they've left us a nice ceiling in there, which you can see their initials boldly displayed. And the area at the back, you have an internal door. There's the door into the priest's room with the open wall. Here's the door that gets you onto the corridor. It looks down onto the kitchen area, and the fireplace is going up here. And then you have these uprising shutters in grooves inside the timbers. But the thing that's different from the drawing here we did in the late 70s is that there is a brace here which indicates that you can't just walk straight through. So this is something I've got to re-examine, but there was certainly an external door that got you up onto the platform here. But there's a bit more information that I need to get. And I'm hoping to get Mark Meltonville up there, because Mark is, as you may know, has been doing a lot of work for many, many years for the Royal Palaces, extremely skilled in cooking and now brewing. He's doing activities both in Ireland and in America of the way that the brewing was done. And he's got some very good videos which you can see online. And this is the setup he's now got at the Weald Downer Museum, where he often demonstrates down there. And at that point, I think I come to an end. Yep. Click to exit. Okay. Stop share.
Excellent timing. Thank you, Timothy. Are there any burning questions for Timothy?
If there isn't, I'd like to just say one more thing, but let's see if there's anybody like. Oh,
Yes, Dorothy. You're muted, Dorothy.
Yeah, on one of the slides you showed us of a gallery with a standing upstairs, there were 2 chandeliers hanging down.
well, I'm sure the chandeliers were later. I mean, you can't dictate to people what they put in galleries these days, but they would have been just.
No, this was a drawing, a contemporary drawing of something going on. There was like a sort of jester coming out of the screen, out of the curtain at the bottom.
Oh, well, that's the yes.
Everyman and Simple Man. There was that. It was that etching.
Okay, well, it's a paste, it's a coloured drawing of the standing at Debenham, but I don't think there are any chandeliers in there. I don't quite know what you saw.
No, it wasn't coloured. It was black and white.
Ah, I'm sorry, I don't know which drawing you're referring to, so I have to pass on. I'll have a look. Yeah. Can I just say something briefly? I didn't touch upon this, the whole business about sort of controlling the entrance into these inns and for the plays. There's a very good example from Norwich where there was an affray in Norwich that went on in the Red Lion, another Red Lion. And this was in 1583 when the Queen's Men, newly formed after Elizabeth by the Earl of Leicester, which Richard Tolton, one of the best known actors, was taking part. And a man called Wisdom and his servant tried to push through and spilt the takings at the gate, which is what you need to have. And there was a fight outside, and the servant of Wisdom in the blue coat was killed. And so there's an assize report on this. So it shows you a very good description, really, of the whole point about these things. The actors are the ones who chased this chap outside and wounded him fatally, and they were the ones who were also taking him up to the gate.
Okay. Well, perhaps you could, if you find it, Dorothy, perhaps you could type a note to Timothy in the chat.
I'll try and answer it then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. I think we need to move on if you don't mind. And we start now a series of talks